the human labor in war economy in the 20th century. We can compare practices existing in the First and the Second World Wars, when the German economic war economy. There are some similarities, there are differences, of course. For example, at the beginning of the First World War, there were special provisions of the German government, the military authorities, that a large number of workers that were already in Germany, citizens of Russia and Poland, under the authority of Russia, who were there in the area of Ruhr. So their status changed and they were transformed into forced workers. Then the practice of deportation of workforce from Belgium and the use of POWs, according to data cited by Herbert, in the German economy and agriculture primarily, was over 28,000 Serbian POWs that were included in these economic activities during the First World War. The Second World War brought with it much harder practice, and we can talk about these categories of voluntary work, contractual-based work, forced work, how we categorize the work of prisoners of war, and also the work of people who were kept captive in the death camps, using slavery in war industry in the Second World War. The fact that in the Third Reich there was over 7.5 million foreign workers, those that came to work. First of all, those categorized as Ostarbeiters from Poland, Ukraine, and other parts of occupied Soviet Union. This is a huge number of people, over 700,000 industrial workers that were employed in German war industry. Speaks to the fact how enormously important human labor was for the German economy of the Third Reich, and all the accompanying issues that existed even before the First World War, connected to the sudden industrialization, the conjuncture of German economy, when Polish workers were there was mass employment of Polish workers in industry, also agriculture in East Prussia. And when started discussions on the dangers of Polonization of German society, even Max Weber's attitudes are very interesting, who is warning of this danger. The Second World War introduced the practice before the war started itself, even after the occupation of the Czech Republic. Since the beginning of the war in Poland, some 350,000 workers were very quickly transferred from Poland to Germany and engaged there, plus 400,000 prisoners of war. In April 1941, we had nearly 100,000 Yugoslav prisoners of war engaged in these groundworks in some areas in Germany. That was temporary engagement, which existed throughout the Second World War, with the ordinary soldiers having better chances because they mostly came from rural areas and worked in German holdings, rural holdings, but the officers were protected from forced labor under the law. There are interesting studies, German experts for the period. One, according to me, is very interesting and important and covering the entire Southeast Europe. Hansek, this is an expert that provided a thorough analysis of German perspectives of German industry towards East Europe. He estimated that only seasonal workers from Southeast Europe each year were exported to Germany at the amount of 1.5 million. And this number of 300,000 is overestimated because initial efforts of occupational authorities and domestic collaboration authorities to export the labor force in Germany were actually interrupted because of the uprising and everything that went on, and because of the need to engage these workers through thought organization and others on the territory of Serbia. And there is a paradox. A huge need for labor force, especially professional workers, was set aside in Serbia. So in October 41, in these mass killings, workers that were working in the airplane factory in Kraljevo or a train car factory, and those for military vehicles in Kragujevac, something that was a priority in the military sense rather than the war economic sense. And for the different categories of workers divided by origin, the legislation that address their status must not be forgotten. And related to Polish workers, is very numerous. There was a ban on any contact with the local population. It was strictly prohibited and punished. And occupied countries were a great source of labor force for the German economy. Thank you. Any questions?
Ništa, samo da nastavite dalje kako se htjeli, dobrovoljni rad, prisilni rad, put zbog radnika u Njemačkoj i
voluntary work and forced to work.
dobrovoljno postaje prinuđeno.
When does it from voluntary, how it transforms into forced? For Banat in Serbia, that would be interesting for me. These are not only formal nuances. An example would be independent Croatian state had a contract, and when you look at the German statistics, there is a category of Orthodox Croats. These were Serbs that went there. You had more chances to survive in Germany as a worker in German military industry or agriculture than staying in the territory of the independent Croatian state. They accounted for 65% of the total number of workers on the territory of Croatia. What does free will choice mean? It's a different issue. They need to turn the mics on for the translators to be able to hear them. This is the key issue between voluntary and forced work, even the work that was formerly voluntary, because we have to say that certain number of people from Serbia would go to the so-called voluntary work in Germany. They had contracts. These were contracts, labor contracts, and they were paid 0.51 Deutschmark per hour, which was very low, but it was some compensation at least. And what's also must be mentioned, the work hours were longer than usual, 10 to 12 hours. They worked somewhat longer than German workers. But I would like to just point out that on the 2nd of June in 1941, there was a meeting between representatives of German Economic Organization and Serbian Collaborationist Administration in Belgrade, when Germans asked for Serbia to send, by the end of that year, 75,000 workers. This idea of voluntarism is not real, because there was a campaign to unrealistically present to the population through posters the situation waiting for them in Germany. On the other hand, and Professor Ristovic already mentioned this, in the autumn of 1941, there were mass killings in Kragujevac, Kraljevo, Šabac, and so on. And the majority of people were very afraid. They thought, because the people were collected out of the streets randomly, a number of workers considered that this was a way for younger men to live for Germany and maybe avoid getting shot. So all these killings were assisted by the collaboration administration. And even though it was not formally forced work, because there were contracts, the situation indicates otherwise. There is also the so-called economically based forced labor, because the economic situation in Serbia was catastrophic, because there was a total devastation, economic devastation in Serbia, especially in towns where the majority of the population were brought to the verge of existence. I will give briefly some quantitative data. Supply was very difficult. There were no foodstuff, textiles, shoewear. Bread could not be bought. The black market opened, of course. And the so-called rations, guaranteed rations, it took a long time to get them, and there were shortages of meat, bacon, salt, rice, flour, and so on. There was no bread, coal, wood, or grease in Belgrade. The rations were reduced from 400 to 250 grams of bread. And in June 1942, the kilo of flour reached the price of 400 grams, corn 300 dinars, cubic meter of wood 2,000 dinars, and opportunities for income were reduced. The wages of non-qualified workers were between 100 and 150 dinars, and administrative salaries were 2,000 to 3,000 dinars. These economic reasons were pressing. This is important to emphasize for the analysis. Serbia was at the time mostly agricultural country, and out of the 4.5 million population, only 480,000 were in the workforce. people had links to the rural areas, which enabled them to survive. Without this, under these conditions, mortality would be much higher. As for transport, certain elements of voluntary work can be spoke about until the end of 42, when people would go to Germany and didn't even know what awaited them there after leaving and going there. They could see that the situation was far from the way it was presented in the propaganda, so that it became more and more compulsory. Not only labor in the country, but also the labor in Germany. I will give some data very shortly. The military commandant of Serbia issued on 22nd March decree on the introduction of a war economy, and the general trustee for Serbia could could order anyone to go and work in an obligatory way, both here and in Germany. So it was legally done. Several thousands of persons from rural areas and workers were forced to work in Germany. So there was no voluntary element from then on. It was enough for somebody to disobey the Quisling authority in a household, and these were now mostly people showing some anti-fascist tendencies, or people who were organized within the People's Liberation Movement. Because I have to finish now, I just want to say that German occupation forces, because this is a direct information, in Kruševac, Zaječar and Negotin in mid-1943 arrested 1,300 people who were not guilty of anything in the streets, and they sent them for forced work in Germany. Would you like to add something? This decree on introducing these war economic measures of the Third Reich caused panic. So collaborationist authorities had to calm things down and reassure people. These are more exceptions than the rule. So sometimes people were just taken out from the street and sent. Some were punished. For example, people from rural areas who did not produce enough product, resistant movement members, and so on. Serbia could not export a lot of workforce because a lot of people were needed for Bor and other places. There's another thing that was mentioned at the beginning, and that Maria said compulsory work was the same as forced labor. Yes, maybe, but in the official practice and jargon, what was called forced labor, it was forced labor under even more difficult conditions. Compulsory workers could go in their free time to the pub or to the shop or do something else. But forced laborers could not leave the camp, could not buy provisions or anything. So they were like prisoners. The situation in which workers coming from allied countries, Bulgaria and so on, there was resistance to sending workers from their territories there. The problem was also that those that went as so-called voluntary workers based on contract basis, there were problems with the payments of these wages, which was done according to unrealistic exchange rates, which created a lot of problems even within internal relations within their countries. So this labor was more valued and less paid, even in allied countries. So categories of workers from allied and non-allied countries was brought closer together in terms of their treatment. And this overall categorization, if you had millions of people that were valued less racially, the system of control had to be huge. And this is why this supervision, special services, followed, monitored workers, ensured punishment and so on, which demonstrated both the huge need for workforce, and on the other hand there was a terrible ideological resistance against these people that were brought there against their will. We have time for only one more question. Nebojša Milikić, Cultural Center Rex. A short association, the discussion between the forced and voluntary reminds me of the current discussion on migration, whether it's for economic reasons or whether they're refugees. The other day, excerpt from the text of the late Olivera Milosavljević was published, calling upon complexity for those advocating for revisionist tendencies. And there was a seminar 2 days ago on the history of Republic of Srpska around everything that happened in the Second World War as an attempt. There was a spectrum of forces, military, economic, ideological, that were fighting for the old world, the colonialist, imperialist world that brought to the development of fascism, and there were forces that resisted. But that is not so difficult to use as a basis to understand all other particular policies and understanding. This division is a bit problematic. This was a marriage of convenience. Churchill and Stalin ideologically were on opposite sides, but neither side changed their ideological assumptions. The complexity does not mean that things are not simplified, but we need to take into account all these different elements. The issue of voluntarism is also linked to the issue of collaborationism. If you have ideological collaboration related to the economic factor, how to see people working in the plane factory or repairing German fighter planes. Are they collaborationists? On one hand they are, on the other they're not, because they're forced to do that. These are all nuances. not related only to our issue, but the general situation of Europe in the Second World War, with the local specificities, talking about how people behave in different situations. It's not black and white, but something is clear. There were those who refused to accept and fought against the system that was supposed to be the new Europe, as it was declared in different ways, regardless of their personal political convictions. Other than those in these various local fascist movements. But in different countries, there were different specific problems that require carefulness in analysis. There were transformations during the war and changes in these areas as well. In this area that we're talking about, it's very important to know Serbia had 5 occupational regimes. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Dalmatia, parts of Croatia, Italian zone. These are all problems for researchers, because the situation was fragmented. There is the division to those that fought against what came about in 1941 and those that are on the other side, and this cannot be questioned. Very shortly, please. Just one sentence, because you mentioned revisionist historiography. I would like to say that this category of forced labor is one of the main categories that is the focus of revisionist historiography in Serbia, that has the aim to rehabilitate Nedic's Quisling administration. And it consists of qualifying forced labor as voluntary. Although from the research perspective, closed empirical research is totally unjustified, these viewpoints are not based in some other new research, but in an ideological attitude, an ideological and political need to rehabilitate Nedic. Forced labor is one of the central categories